hear me back there? Yeah. Okay. I'm very technologically stupid, so I'll probably have some glitches and things won't work. So this is me. I've been at Berkeley for about 10 years. I was a journalist for a long time, and I have a public health degree. And this project is really just an accidental project for me. I just kind of fell into it. I have a friend who got sick about 25 years ago, and I was curious about it, but I never really looked into it. And then I started doing some reporting about it when the mouse retrovirus XMRV situation was happening. And the PACE trial came out during that time, and I'd never heard of it. And because I hadn't really, I was just focused on one aspect. And so, anyway, it started from that. And I started reading later, as I had more time, I started reading some of the patient commentaries about the PACE trial. And eventually I thought, oh, this is just, and I looked at the PACE trial and I thought, it doesn't look right. And I'm not an epidemiologist or a biostatistician, so I showed it to colleagues at Berkeley, and they all said, this really stinks. You really have to, look into it. So that's how it all happened. And I thought I would do one big piece, which is what I did, a 15,000-word piece. I'll get to that in a second. And that would be the end of it. I had no idea that 3 years later I'd still be talking about the same thing, and I wouldn't be on to another project, but here I am. Anyway, so there's a big question, which is that PACE is an example of an open-label trial, so everybody knows who's getting what treatment or what non-treatment. And the outcomes were completely subjective. So we know that they had objective outcomes, but they kind of discarded all of them as worthless since they didn't show any results. So basically, this is the main problem with all of the studies promoting cognitive behavior therapy, graded exercise therapy. Let's include the lightning process in that, because the one study that seemed to show that had an effect was an open-label trial with subjective outcomes. That's also a fraudulent piece of work, which I can discuss in a little bit. So basically, these trials are all so full of bias that you can't really tell in the end if the results mean anything, because at the end you can't tell how much of the result was the actual result and how much of the result was somebody just saying it because they wanted to believe it was true, because they thought it was true, because they wanted to please the therapist. There's all sorts of reasons why unblinded trials with subjective outcomes, we don't use them in other medical fields. We don't use them to approve drugs for pharmaceuticals for anything, right? We don't recognize them anymore as trials that provide reliable data, because they don't. They're good for, I'm not sure what they're good for, but in this field, they're still doing these kinds of trials, and they're still assuming that they provide reliable data, even though in all other fields of medicine, no parent, unless it's an emergency, would give their child medications that were approved solely on the basis of the way that the CBT and GDT were approved for this. You would never do it by giving people the drug and a placebo. Everybody knows what they're taking. At the end, you don't actually do any blood tests to see if people got better. You just say people said, oh, I feel better, and then you approve the drug. That doesn't happen. Parents don't give their children drugs on that, and they don't take them themselves that way, usually. So basically, the entire field within which the PACE trial falls is complete nonsense. It doesn't provide any reliable data, and no policy should ever be made based on it. No clinical trial recommendation should ever be made based on it. I'm not saying, and I won't be saying, nobody ever got better, or nobody ever felt they got better from cognitive behavior therapy, graded exercise therapy, or the lightning process. It's impossible to say. There's many, many people with ME, many people who think they have ME who may have something else. We don't even know quite really what it is. So it's really hard to say categorically, no, of course nobody could ever possibly improve with some psychotherapy. Of course they might improve. Of course some people might improve with some exercise. However, there's just no good evidence that that works on a population level, and we need evidence of something that works for a population to come up with clinical guidelines that are effective and that are accurate, or to come up with public health policy. And because of this problem, this entire field of data is totally bogus and really should not be the basis for anything. So, about PACE, well, it's an easy audience if that's all it takes to get involved. So these are some big questions questions about PACE specifically. So I have a lot of slides, and I'm terrible, as I said, I'm terrible technologically, so there's not a lot of visuals and cute bunny rabbits hopping around. So I'm just going to talk, and I can email this to anybody if you wanted to read this later. But basically, in the PACE trial, people had already met outcome thresholds at baseline, right? We know that. Both primary measures. So why is that in the domain called science? That's an impossibility. You can't be recovered and disabled simultaneously on a measure. If you are, there's a problem with the measure and there's a problem with your study. So that cannot be in the domain called science. Is there a place in science for a study in which participants were simultaneously disabled and recovered on a measure? I would say no. Why has this study been defended for so long by the UK academic and medical establishment, and by people here, and by people everywhere around the world? It is insane. This is insane. You all are not the climate change deniers. These people are all the climate change deniers, okay? These are the insane people who are making insane arguments based on insane research. This is what's interesting to me too, why are patients defamed for pointing this out? And why is it apparently controversial for me to stand here and say that this is unacceptable? So I've been criticized for a lot of things by these people. I've had complaints to my university about my work. All I'm saying is that you can't have a study in which people are recovered on an outcome measure at baseline. That is not a controversial statement to make. So I'm sort of shocked to have become a controversial figure for making what are, to me, common sense arguments. Okay, I don't need to go through all this. You all know sort of this stuff. Royal-free, my applicant's encephalomyelitis, blah, blah, blah. PACE study, 1988, chronic fatigue syndrome, and so on. Okay. One of the big problems, as we know, is that there's so many case definitions that people are studying different things. So it's probably, as we know also, not one illness. It's probably a cluster of similar-looking illnesses, or a cluster of related illnesses, or different things that push people in a similar direction. Given that, there's probably going to be different subgroups, and it may be different for people who got infected with one thing that triggered it, or difference based on genetics, and all sorts of differences in the patient population. One of the reasons why, and that everybody's using different case definitions. So that's a real problem. The biggest problem, of course, is the Oxford criteria, which is basically 6 months of unexplained fatigue. So you don't have to be brilliant to understand that that's a proxy for a lot of things that may not be ME. Particular for undiagnosed depressive and anxiety disorders, for just fatigue that people have that we don't sometimes have an explanation for, idiopathic chronic fatigue. So there's all sorts of things that can fall into that. And if you do a study with a cohort, with a population, with people having all sorts of different things, you're probably not going to find anything because everybody's somewhat different. The other thing is that people with depression, anxiety disorders, and so on very likely will benefit from cognitive behavior therapy and exercise. So it wouldn't be unusual if you did a study like that where you were calling people as having CFS, even though some of them just had chronic fatigue, you might get some reports that look like the people in that study are doing better because some of them are depressed, and they may do better because they're depressed. So you might do studies like that and look like you're getting results for people with chronic fatigue syndrome, even though part of the people that are getting the improvements are people with chronic fatigue and not chronic fatigue syndrome. So that case definition is terrible. The Fukuda one from the CDC is marginally better, but again, it doesn't require what we know is the core symptom, which is post-exertional malaise. Now that's also a problem because we don't even quite know how to define post-exertional malaise, because it's somewhat different and different people define it differently. However, there are two definitions, the 2003 and the 2011 definition, which both include that as some form of that as a required symptom, as well as the Institute of Medicine definition which is now called in the U.S. the National Academy of Medicine. They came up with a definition for SEID, if anybody can pronounce that in English. I'd be interested because I don't know how to pronounce it. But anyway, they renamed it, and they also put post-exertional malaise at the center. They renamed it systemic exertion intolerance disease. This case definition, these old case definitions mostly have problems. The IOM one has a problem in that it doesn't exclude people with depression, anxiety disorders, and so on, which is not a problem necessarily in clinical care, but it is a problem when you're doing research. So there's a lot of problems, and most patients would prefer either the 2011 definition or the 2003, and there's a big struggle going on over that now, and what should be done. But, oh wait a minute, that presents a lot of problems. So There were 2 reports in the US that were both very large base studies, reviews really. One was from the Institute of Medicine, one was from the National Institutes of Health. They both had problems. I'm not going to go into the issues with these studies, but they both had good points too. Basically, they both made it clear that this was not a psychological illness, that this was a serious organic disease, that people really had devastating symptoms that could not be explained away by false ideations and deconditioning. And they also, the IRM report, we focused it away from fatigue and conditioning, to exertion intolerance, in other words, putting post-exertional malaise, or whatever one calls it, at the center. And the NIH made the useful suggestion that the Oxford criteria should be retired, because the idea being that when you use the Oxford criteria, you generate heterogeneous samples. So samples with a lot of different kinds of people, and you're not going to be able to get any good findings. So they made that very clear. So it really does leave us wondering why 3 years later, or was it 3 years later, this was 2015, we're still in this ridiculous situation. I think a lot of it has to do with the deference in the UK that people pay to people with titles and professors and people with knighted people and all that kind of thing. I'm American, so I don't really do deference. I don't really go into another country, and I try to be polite. But I don't see that professors, just because they're professors, if they're doing bad work, they should be given any particular deference by me. So I don't do deference, and I think that's why it's been a problem for them in the UK, because I come in there and I go there and I tear up their paper in public, and they don't know what to do about me. They don't know how to deal with that. So PACE trial was set up as a definitive study of cognitive behavior therapy, graded exercise therapy. We knew there had been earlier studies in the 90s that, again, seemed to show that these treatments were effective. Patients reported that they felt better. So here it basically used the Oxford criteria as their primary case definition, so that's a problem. Anyway, all these basically things. So basically it was based on the unproven theory that all symptoms are due to deconditioning because of patients' dysfunctional cognitions about their illness. So nobody's actually really sick. They just seem to have these unhelpful beliefs, and because they're unhelpful beliefs, they stay in bed, and because they stay in bed, they get deconditioned, and because they get deconditioned, they get terrible symptoms. Because they have terrible symptoms, they think they have something called ME, then they stay in bed more, and then they get even worse symptoms, and they get into what they call a vicious cycle. This is such a ridiculous idea, and so preposterous that these people think that millions of people around the world want nothing better than to spend their entire lives in bed. It's just bizarre that one would, this is a theory that you can't prove or unprove. It's just a statement of something, belief, and there's no way to unprove it. You can't study this theory. And the only way you can study it is if the treatments work. The treatments don't work. They've rejiggered all their stuff to make it seem like they work. So that proves the theory's wrong. But it's just ridiculous. You can't ever prove that it's right. Or it's just one of those things like psychiatrists often like to do, where they tell you things, but the more you defend against it, the more it proves that you actually have what it is they tell you have. If you say, no, I'm not defensive, well, why are you being defensive? Why are you denying it? Well, you obviously are defensive. So this is an illness that the belief that you have an illness is actually one of the criteria for not having the illness, right? Because basically, if you believe you have ME, that's part of your sick ideation, that you have something, and that therefore it shows that you have what they call chronic fatigue syndrome, which is the absence of any actual physical illness. Now, they will say now that no, they've never said there's no biology. If you read PACE, it says if these things work, it doesn't necessarily mean, but that's all just kind of small print at the bottom. What they really think, what they've posited for 30 years, is that people do not have an organic illness. They try to shift it now because they realize things are moving in the other direction, and they want to preserve their paradigm without giving it up. So they want to say, well, we never really said there was no biological underpinnings, blah, 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 but they really did say that. They just say now that they never really said that, and there's a fine print in the paper that sort of indicates, well, just because this might work doesn't mean that there's nothing causing the illness. But again, that's just fine print that nobody pays attention to, and that is irrelevant when you're presenting your findings. So basically, there are biomedical research efforts happening in the US and elsewhere, and I should have put here Bergen as well. So I'm sorry for that omission. I didn't prepare this specifically for Norway, but I should have put that there. So basically, one of the ideas is that we know most people get it after an acute infection, often a viral infection. And so that seems to trigger these hyperimmune and inflammatory responses, and then also disrupts neurological functioning, leads to mitochondrial inefficiencies and energy production, and so on and so forth. We don't really know exactly what's going on. Obviously, if we knew, then we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in. But there's a lot of things that seem to be going on, and there seems to be something that's being triggered by this either a bad case of glandular fever or a bad flu or whatever viral infection people get. And so most likely it's a spectrum of related disorders. It could be also some people report from environmental toxins. Other people feel very strongly about mold. They have mold intolerance. Sometimes people report after bad surgery or traumatic car accident or other physiological illnesses. So it seems like any number of things can lead to this pathway. Wait, I'm going backwards now. I keep skipping. Okay, here. So this is where they're doing the CBT, biopsykosocial stuff, a number of places. I guess you have your own lightning process experts here as well, as I've heard. So this is the history of the PACE trial. It was, not the history, some results. The first results in 2011, then the recovery results in 2013. I published my investigation that I thought would just be a one-off, 15,000 words on October 2015. Right after that, Lancet Psychiatry published another ridiculous study claiming that they were long-term, that it showed that there were no long-term benefit from CBT and GDT, but they managed to turn that into a success story for CBT and GDT. Everything they've done, much of what they've done, I would consider to be research misconduct. I've said that, I say that later on. You know, what they've done is really shocking stuff in the way they've interpreted their data. It's really stuff that you don't do as a scientist. Alan Matthews, around the same time, he won, he's the Australian patient who fought in the court system. I don't know if you're all familiar with this, but he basically filed for data from the PACE trial. They called it vexatious, as they called a lot of the requests for under Freedom of Information Act in the UK. But he pursued it, they denied it, he pursued it, and he won at the tribunal level, which is the first level of the court system there. That was in 2016. In 2016, the tribunal ordered Queen Mary University of London to release the raw trial data. What people wanted to do was to calculate the findings as they said they would present them in their protocol. They changed things from the protocol and presented completely different results, which seemed to be positive. They never presented or provided the data for their initial results, and patients wanted to know, understandably, what would your results have been if you hadn't, after the fact, changed all the way you measured everything. That's a very reasonable thing to do. You're not supposed to change anything after a protocol anyway. If you do, you're supposed to statistically indicate what impact that had on your findings. They never did that. That's really, really bad science. It's shocking that the Lancet published the study without making them do that. No journal should allow these kinds of switches to be made without requiring the researchers to provide their original data, or to provide an estimate or a calculation about how much the changes impacted the findings. That's what patients wanted to find out. So they published their own revisions of improvement, which showed that their rates of improvement fell from about 60% to 20%, which was like a two-thirds drop. And then a group published the recovery findings, showing that instead of 22% recovering, as they claimed, which was 3 times the number in the other groups, basically there was the recovery rate for their original findings, their original measures, was basically in the single digits for all the groups, and there were no differences in findings among any of the groups. Finally, in March of this year, BMC Psychology published a reanalysis of the improvement, recovery, and everything, and showed that basically the whole trial was really bogus and didn't have any good findings at all, if you just went by what they originally said that they would do, okay? So when you do a trial, you write a protocol, and you get funded based on what you say you're going to do in the protocol, and you get ethics approval, you get all approvals based on that. You don't make changes to that just because you say later, we think other changes were better. That's why they made changes. That's the only reason. So the conclusion was of this March 2018 paper was that the outcome switching made all of their results basically into positive, good results that they could report. Instead of the results that they actually got were either null results, like no results, or very, very minor ones that were clearly placebo-induced. So the 20% improvement rate, in the other comparison groups, there was a 10% improvement rate. So that's only a 1 in 10 improvement rate. That's very, very marginal when you consider that it's an open label trial with subjective outcomes, and you're going to have a lot of placebo effect anyway. And the two CBT and GET trial arms were told routinely that this will make you better. This is already shown to improve people. This has already been shown to be effective. So the people in those groups were already getting messages routinely that this treatment is told to work. You cannot do that in a clinical trial and maintain, reliable data. That is not done. Even if it's in this case, part of the therapies, but it really screws up their ability to claim anything, given the way they design their trial. They really can't claim anything because that's part of the trial is to induce a placebo effect, part of these treatments. Okay. So these are just some expert responses. What I was able to do, so patients knew all these terrible things about the trial by the time I got there, because they had already looked at it and analyzed it up and down. They could see that it was a piece of garbage. I was able to bring outside scientists into it. They couldn't get any traction on it because they were patients and they were able to be portrayed by the researchers as crazy, hysterical, and climate change denying type people who don't understand science or are just sort of hysterical and so on. Now, they might call me hysterical and anti-climate change denying, but they would be stupid to do that. They try to make me into a crazy seeming patient, but I do happen to be an academic and a journalist, and I do happen to have academic colleagues that I can go to for support, which was more difficult for patients. So what I was able to do with my initial thing that I think was able to move the issue is that I was able to talk to colleagues at Berkeley and other colleagues elsewhere and get them to say really, really scathing, terrible things about the PACE trial. Now, scientists generally do not like to say terrible things about other people's work if they're not involved in a direct dispute with them or if there's no reason for them to enter the fray. They would never say something like this: the height of clinical trial amateurism, as Bruce Levin, a well-known biostatistician at Columbia. I've called the PACE trial a piece of crap. I've called it doggy poo. I've called it a piece of nonsense and bullshit. But this is the academic equivalent of calling something doggy poo. Okay? He didn't say doggy poo or a piece of crap, but he said the height of clinical trial amateurism. In academia, that's pretty much the same thing, probably worse. John Davis at Stanford, so he might be criticized as having a conflict of interest because his son is very, very seriously ill, and that's why he's spending all his time on this. Anyway, he said he's shocked that the Lancet published it. Jonathan Edwards is a well-known professor emeritus in expert in rheumatoid arthritis, so he was very involved in the rituximab stuff. And so he called it a massive incomprehensibility. Art Reingold is the head of epidemiology at Berkeley. He's my he's the head of my department. So he said an independent review of the trial, which seemed to be very much in order. I've called it a piece of crap. Carol Monaghan, who is the MP in the UK, she called it, she's a Scottish MP, she said one of the biggest medical scandals of the 21st century. I've tried to correct that and tell her I think it's one of the biggest medical scandals of the current millennium, even though the millennium is only 18 years old, but she's still sticking with the 21st century. I'm going with the millennium. And Professor Esther Cawley, one of my best friends, she's called for a great, great trial. And the title of my talk was A Thing of Beauty. Simon Leslie, who's a very distinguished, knighted person, knighted partly for his courage in standing up to aggressive, threatening ME patients. He called it A Thing of Beauty. So he has a distorted perception, I think, of beauty. So my thing ran in 3 years ago, and it was 15,000 words, and my colleague at Columbia, Vincent Raccanello, who's a really good guy, published it. He didn't, I had lawyers vetting it and stuff like that, but he took a gamble. I mean, he knew me, so he trusted me, but if I was wrong, we both could have been sued from here to wherever, but they haven't sued me, and I'm still here. There were complaints to Berkeley about me, and I'm still here. So we can figure that those complaints maybe weren't taken too seriously at Berkeley. So things have happened after my virology blog series. What I started to do was I thought if you publish a 15,000 word expose and you show all this terrible stuff, the trial wouldn't survive. It would have to be retracted pretty quickly. If it was a breast cancer trial or any trial about any disease that people thought was normal, it would never have been published in the first place with these flaws probably, but it would have been retracted instantaneously, and a big expose would have been front page news everywhere, whatever. That didn't happen. So I thought, what am I going to do? What's my next move? I already blew my wad on this thing. It didn't do what it was supposed to do, which was get rid of the trial. So then I thought, okay, I'll do these open letters. So I started putting together letters and having people sign them and sending them to the Lancet and this one and that one. And so the first one I did was this open letter to the Lancet with 42 leading people saying this is a piece of garbage. Not in so many words, but you have to do this and that. We did one to Psychological Medicine, which published the recovery paper that had more than 100 experts. We had an open letter to the trial now, in August this year, to the Lancet, that had 114 experts, 10 MPs, and 70 organizations from all around the world. That actually got coverage in the Times of London, and BMJ covered it. MRC, the Medical Research Council, which was the main funder of the PACE trial in the UK, they responded and they defended PACE, partly based on the Cochrane reviews, which is a whole other can of worms, which some of you may know about. So these are just I wrote 15,000 words, and I couldn't even write about everything that was wrong with this trial. So there's a lot more that was wrong, but these are just a few of the main things that I found very interesting. So this outcome switching, lack of legitimate informed consent, biasing participants with newsletter, to me all these things should be reasons for retraction. The fact that it was an open label trial with subjective outcomes, and the fact that they used the Oxford criteria, these are both examples of really bad science. But it's hard to say that it constitutes scientific misconduct of the same level of these, because basically the Oxford criteria is a published set of criteria. So it's published in the literature. You actually can use it without being accused of research misconduct. It shouldn't be in the literature. It's a bad case definition, but there it is. Same as open label studies with subjective outcomes. They're accepted for publication. They're in the literature. It's a bad design, and really they shouldn't be, people should not be focusing on these kinds of trials, but they're being done, and it's bad science, but I wouldn't say reason for to call something research misconduct. I would just say that's a bad scientist. The outcome switching in PACE. How many of you are familiar with this outcome switching, or do I have to go into detail about what it was? Basically, on both their primary outcomes of fatigue and physical function, they lowered the threshold for what it meant to be either within the normal range, of what they called it, or recovered, or somehow having gotten better from that. And both times they did that, they lowered the threshold to below the level you had to get into the trial in the first place. That meant people could be simultaneously defined as recovered for physical function and severely disabled for physical function. The same with fatigue, but it's a little more complicated, so I didn't go into it here. So basically, you could start, you have to enter the trial, you have to get 65 or below to show that you were disabled. When they started the trial, in their protocol, you had to get 85 or above to be recovered on physical function. When they published the trial, you had to get 60 or above to be recovered for physical function. So obviously that's a big drop, and obviously 60 to be recovered is lower than 65, which is the threshold for being disabled to get into the trial. This is impossible. Any study with this, and this was in the Lancet too, they didn't call it recovered, they called it within the normal range, but it was still the outcome measure. So you cannot in a trial be recovered on an outcome measure at baseline or have met the outcome threshold at baseline. If you have, there's a problem with your entire trial and you have to start from scratch. Okay? You cannot publish this work unless you're the PACE authors and you're going to the Lancet. Then you can, but in the normal course of events, you cannot publish work like this. Why were these people? So as it turns out, 13% of the 641 participants already had met this threshold when they entered the trial. So they already were recovered for physical function when they entered the trial. Why were they in the trial? More importantly, why was this not disclosed in any of their publications? That's research misconduct. You can't have something like that and then not disclose it to your readers. It's just not, you can't have something like that in the first place. If you have something like that, for whatever reason, you cannot disclose it. They have many, many other outcome switching examples. Every time they switched an outcome measure, they made it weaker. So it made it easier to show positive results, okay? Again, you can't do that. You just talks, I say, you can't do that. And I say that so many times, and I say, it's insane so many times in the course of a talk. But it is insane. It's just insane. It drives me nuts every time I see it. And as you see it over the course of whatever, I get more and more agitated, my arms start flying everywhere. And every time I do this, I can't believe it. What were their answers? We changed outcome measures before seeing the results, so they were pre-specified. So this is an example of what they try to do always to change the English language. Pre-specified means, in English, related to clinical trials, before you start the goddamn trial, when you write your protocol, that's pre-specified. Pre-specified doesn't mean after you've collected all your data, but before you've looked at it yet. Okay, that's what they did was they collected all their data, and then before they looked at it, they said, they changed their outcome measures. Well, the problem with that is that if you're doing an unblinded trial and you have subjective outcomes, you don't need to see your data to know what your trends are. Unless you're incredibly stupid, and these are not stupid people, you actually know during the trial, are people getting better? Are people in the arm? You know who's in which arm, and you know who says they're getting better. So you know what your trends are. You don't need to see the data. So that's bogus. That's a completely ridiculous answer. We decided our original measures were too stringent. Then why did you bother to write a goddamn protocol? The point of writing a protocol is that you can't make that change after the fact. You had 2 years to write your protocol. Why didn't you come up with measures you thought were appropriate? You can't decide after the fact that they were too stringent. And obviously, if you thought they were too stringent, then you're weakening them to get better results. That's what you're doing. So why don't you admit that? It doesn't matter that people were recovered on key variable because we had other recovery measures as well. This is so ridiculous. I've never heard a response like this. We have it's like, there was Groucho Marx, Groucho Marx, he was a famous comedian in the first half of the 20th century, made a lot of movies in the US. He had one famous line he said, these are my principles. If you don't like these principles, let me know. I have other principles I can go to. So this is what they're saying, like, well, this recovery doesn't matter. Look over here, look over here. It's like Toto in the Wizard of Oz. You know the Wizard of Oz when the Toto pulls in the movie, Toto pulls the curtain hiding the wizard, and the big wizard on the screen says, "Don't look at that man behind the curtain. I'm the wizard." Anyway, it's all bogus. It's ridiculous. You can't say, "Oh, this main recovery measure doesn't work, but we have other recovery measures." It's just nonsense. The revised measures for CBT best average results. Well, that's true. So what they did was they took their original primary outcomes, which were rates. So a rate is 20% got better, 30% got worse, and whatever percent stayed the same. So they changed that into an average. So what they did was they averaged the results for everybody in the CBT group, everybody in the GBT group, and so on. That's fine, but it's not that useful. So if I'm a patient, I want to know from my doctor, and my doctor wants to be able to tell me, if you do this, 30% got better, 15% got worse, and X percent said it didn't do any difference. The average is not that important because let's face it, like we could take the average of everybody in this room of our salaries, right? Now, if Bill Gates suddenly entered the room, and then we took the average again, all our salaries would seem, on an average, seem to have shot up enormously, right? But that's only because there's one outlier in the room. If you're taking an average, you have no idea if there are outliers that are causing the average to go up. So you don't really know whether there's one or two people who did spectacularly and everybody else did badly, or whether really everybody sort of met the average increase. So it's just not that useful. And they claim that those who tweaked the outcomes for the reanalyses, that those who reanalyzed everything tweaked the outcome measures. Well, no. They untweaked what you had tweaked, because you tweaked your own outcome measures to get better results. The reanalyzing people untweaked what you had tweaked. They weren't tweaking themselves, they were untweaking your unauthorized or your badly authorized tweaks, okay? So that's the first thing. So they did not obtain informed consent. What do I mean by this? Well, they did have consent forms, obviously, and everybody signed them. However, in the PACE-studien protocol, they promised to observe the Declaration of Helsinki. Now, I never heard of the Declaration of Helsinki before I started this project, but the Declaration of Helsinki is a human rights declaration or human rights document that was promulgated after World War II, and that basically to protect human research subjects. And we understand why after World War II it was necessary to have a human rights document protecting human research subjects because of Nazi Germany. So this is a very important human rights protocol. And at the time that the PACE trial was doing their consent forms, it was very explicit in what was required to get informed consent from patients. You have to tell them, quote, any possible conflicts of interest and any institutional affiliations. That covers a broad category because it's any possible conflicts of interest. It's not something that someone's determined after some court hearing that's a conflict of interest. Any possible conflicts of interest is fairly broad. The PACE authors, the three main PACE authors, have had long-standing contacts and links with disability insurance companies as well as government agencies, and they did not disclose these. And they've basically been advising disability insurance companies that CBT and GET should be offered to claimants with ME to get them back to work, and they shouldn't be offered benefits because until they go through CBT and GET, because these are the treatments that are proven to work. Well, they need to disclose this to their people. That because they promised to follow the Declaration of Helsinki, they need to have disclosed this to participants. So they basically have no informed consent. They have consent, but it's not informed. So from my perspective, they had no ethical right, and I would say maybe legal right, but I don't know, I'm not a lawyer. They had no right, really, to publish any of their data because they did not have informed consent. So we told the journals about our possible conflict. These are their answers. Well, this is ridiculous because in Nazi Germany, they were not torturing journals, and they were not torturing journal editors, they were torturing human subjects. So the Declaration of Helsinki was not written to protect journals, it was not written to protect journal editors, or journal readers, it was written to protect human subjects. So to tell us that you made your disclosures to the journals is totally irrelevant, it had nothing to do with the Declaration of Helsinki, so it's a stupid argument, don't make it. Insurance companies were not involved in the study. Again, a conflict of interest does not reside solely in the fact that someone has funded something. If you're advising people, if you're advising disability insurance companies that these treatments work, and at the same time you're investigating whether the treatments work, I would say there's a conflict of interest because you have a vested interest in coming up with positive findings. So this is a non-response. Only 3 of the 19 investigators who work for insurance companies. Well, that's a ridiculous answer. First, 4 of them had ties, not 3, but I don't see why what that has to do with anything. So then you disclose 3 of those people having their conflicts. It turns out that only 3, they say, only 3, but those were the 3 principal investigators. So those were the ones we care about. First, so that's a bogus thing. Then you have the newsletter. Again, they spend a lot of time in the therapy, and if you look at the CBT and GET manuals of the therapy, there are quite a lot of statements in there that this is proven to be effective, this is some other patients report this is made for better. So they have a lot of positive messaging in there about the effectiveness of the treatments. They also did this in a participant newsletter that was published in December 2008 when they still had about 200 people in the trial. About a third of the trial were still getting assessed. And they had something in here that was very interesting, and glowing testimonials from participants who finished the trial. Now, I've never seen anything like that. I mean, the idea that you have past participants telling current participants what fantastic trial they're in is really, really, really bizarre. You just don't do that. I'm so happy to, because what are people reading that going to think? They're going to think, oh my God, I'm in this trial, I better be feeling better. And so then when they're asked if they're feeling better, they're going to, like you said, they are. And also, the NICE guidelines, so this newsletter had testimonials, and it also had an article. NICE, which is the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. The H is missing here, but NICE is the clinical guidelines in the UK, right? So the newsletter also had an article about how the NICE guidelines recommend CBT, GET, and activity management based on the best available evidence. So again, this is telling participants in their trial that these 2 treatments that you're in our trial, have already been shown to be based on the best available evidence. So you better, if you're in the CBT or GET arm, you better be doing better because it's already been proven to be the best available treatment. So if you're not doing better, there's got to be something wrong with you, probably, right? So this was in the newsletter that was for participants that they were still in the trial. This is kind of shocking. So what were their answers? The treatment arms were not mentioned in testimonials, so there could have been no bias. Okay, it's hard to know how to respond to such a claim. This is so ridiculous. I can't even begin to tell you how ridiculous that is. First of all, if you read the testimonials, you can tell that they're mostly from the active treatment arms. They refer to the treatment, they refer to therapy. They could be referring to the adaptive pacing therapy, which was the pacing arm, but they sound pretty active. And it also doesn't matter because basically you can't bias everybody in a positive direction in your study. That's also not right. That's sort of what they were doing, but I think you could tell, people could read between the lines which were the active arms that they were interested in and which were not. The article about NICE in the newsletter mentioned just CBT, but they mentioned that mentioned activity management, and they claimed that that was the third treatment offered in PACE. Well, again, ridiculous. The third treatment offered in PACE was what they called adaptive pacing therapy. And as they wrote in PACE, it was operationalized from pacing, and it was being tested for the first time ever in the PACE trial. So how it could possibly be the same as activity management, it's insane. I don't understand why they would make that argument. So this is bogus. And this was one of my favorite things. One of my colleagues at Berkeley, when he looked at I showed him the newsletter, and I said, is this normal? Can you send this out? And he looked at the testimonials, and he said, well, I mean, they sent this out, they published this during the trial, and I said, yeah. And he said, well, I guess there's no prohibition against testimonials from past participants. He said, but I think that's because it never occurred to anybody that a scientist would try to do such a thing. So, again, people at Berkeley, who I used as my kind of brain trust in this whole thing, since I'm not an epidemiologist, and I'm not a mental statistician, they were routinely telling me that this study was garbage. Within a year of my doing this, it was being used in Berkeley epidemiology classes as a case study of journal research. So it's now become, a pedagogical tool at Berkeley. So it's an example of research misconduct. So these are some examples from the Medical Research Council in the UK. Misrepresentation of data, for example, suppression of relevant findings and/or data, or knowingly, recklessly, or by gross negligence presenting a flawed interpretation of data. Another from the Medical Research Council, misrepresentation of interest, including failure to declare material interest either of the research for the funders of the research. And this is from the National Institutes of Health in the US. It's essentially the same as the first one from the MRC, manipulating research materials or not providing or omitting data, changing or omitting data, such that research is not accurately represented in a research record. I would say that certainly, sorry. I told you I was technologically challenged. So I would say that I've already just documented very quickly that really PACE seems to meet these criteria. They certainly suppressed evidence. 13% of participants were covered on your key verb, have met meeting outcome thresholds on your key variable. I would say certainly suppressing relevant evidence, and without that evidence, it changes your interpretation of the findings. Certainly they misrepresented their interest in terms of their informed consent, and so on. So I would say that it's likely that this is research misconduct. Now, I will say that I'm not the person who is charged with assessing whether something's research misconduct, but I think it's a very likely outcome of any real legitimate investigation into whether this is research misconduct. I would think should conclude likely that it was. So these are conclusions. The results can't be taken at face value, and basically they prove the opposite of what they claim. If they presented their original results and not manipulated them with outcome switches at all, if they presented them as they've done them in their protocol, then they would have had to say, hey, we didn't really get much here, we were wrong, we're sorry, we made a mistake, it's over. That would have been at least honest and would have been really the conclusion they should have reached, which is that these treatments don't work to do anything other than produce a marginal placebo effect for a period of time, because that effect didn't last. I mean, by the follow-up study that I mentioned, there were no differences between the groups at the end. So, the results didn't last. The data manipulations, lack of informed consent, and other issues could lead to the conclusion that this is research misconduct according to standard definitions. And the PACE authors have no legitimate defenses for their terrible methodological choices. They are their cronies of the anti-science crowd, like climate change deniers, not the PACE patients. And the best use of PACE is a pedagogical tool in epidemiology classes and biostats classes. I would say this also, the defamation or the accusing patients of being climate change deniers. And I don't know how much the term gaslighting is used here. Do you know the term gaslighting? No? Yes? No? Okay. So gaslighting was from a 1940 '44 Ingrid Bergman movie. She won her first Oscar for Gaslight, the movie Gaslight, and her husband's trying to drive her crazy, and the idea is that the gaslights, he's turning on the gas lights on and off, so that she thinks it's on, but he turns it off. So he's gaslighting her. He's trying to make her go crazy because the lights are going on and off. In the US, this term was around for a long time, and it lost favor, but since President Trump came in, there's a lot of gaslighting going on, so people are using the word gaslighting again very commonly. And I see the PACE office have gaslighted the patients, doctors, the medical community for decades now, and they've gaslighted them by presenting their bad research as good research, by manipulating their data, changing their outcome measures, and by claiming that patients or anybody who criticizes them is somehow anti-science or is somehow bad, or like me, is somehow behaving in a destructive way, needs to complain to his university about his bad behavior. That's all gaslighting. Trying to convince my university that I'm a bad person because I'm pointing out their flaws in their research is they're trying to gaslight my university. They're trying to gaslight all of you. So the best use of PACE is as a pedagogical tool in academic classes. And, the Cochrane reviews. This is a huge mess. I don't even think I should get into it, but the Cochrane reviews, everybody knows about Cochrane, or yes or no? They do meta-analyses of studies of a lot of things. With PACE, kind of nobody really defending PACE much anymore. The Cochrane reviews that have found that CBT and GET are effective are sort of the thing that stand, the last thing that stand propping up this stupid paradigm. The problem is that the people, CFS is in the Common Mental Health Disorder section. The reviews are done, actually, the one under contention have been done in Norway. The exercise review, that's been the source of a lot of turmoil recently. The authors, at least the lead authors from here, and it's a terrible review. But there's been Cochrane, anyway, it's a big mess. It's not been, there's an effort to get it withdrawn. It hasn't been withdrawn. The authors are making some minor revisions, probably. We don't know what it's going to look like, but it's actually a very troubling situation. Cochrane, so the last time I did it, Cochrane decided to withdraw the exercise review, but they haven't withdrawn it because the authors went to the press and created a whole mess. Anyway, it's a big mess. I won't go into it. So this is basically my thanks. Basically, I want to make sure that it's clear that patients understood all this stuff long before I did. I piggybacked on the patient's work, and I did what I could do to bring other academics into the issue. Vincent Racaniello, my colleague at Columbia, who trusted my reporting and never, balked at publishing what I wrote. These are my experts that I weighed in initially. Berkeley has faced multiple complaints about me, so I want to thank them for basically not. The complaints have generally been I'm behaving badly, but not that there's anything wrong with my work. So, behaving badly to them means that I'm tearing up their paper in public and calling it a piece of crap. But it is a piece of crap, and it deserves to be torn up in public. So I didn't see that I did anything wrong. And I guess not just Berkeley. The Center for Global Public Health is my unit at Berkeley, and my colleagues and everybody who saw my open letters. And I think that's it. I just want to say one thing about the lightning process study, because I know that has come up if any of you were here earlier today. So the lightning process, I've never heard of it because no one does it in the US as far as I know. I only heard about it first in connection with ME, because there was a study published last year in a BMJ journal that seemed to show that it was effective. Now, the study is, again, an example of flagrant research misconduct. I've documented this at length. I've complained multiple times to BMJ. BMJ knows it's a problem. BMJ has placed a notice on that paper explaining that there were some irregularities and that they were trying to figure out what to do. What they did was some of the same things the PACE authors did. They, in that study, which was done out of Bristol by Professor Esther Crawley, who was the main investigator, they did what they call a feasibility study. So that was in like a pilot study of 100 56 participants. Then usually you would do a feasibility study, then you decide it was feasible, and then you would do a completely other study, and you'd sort of figure out what your outcome should be and so on based on your feasibility study, what works, what's acceptable to participants. Well, they did something else. They got permission to extend the feasibility study into the full trial, so the feasibility study participants also became participants in the full trial. At the same time as they got permission to do that, they changed their primary and secondary outcome measures, so their former primary outcome measure, which was school attendance at 6 months, became a secondary measure, and their former secondary measure, which was physical function at 6 months, became the primary measure. So that was already after they'd selected 56 out of the 100 participants and gathered data from them. So they changed their outcome measures more than midway through, and at the end they reported that the new primary outcome had positive results, but lo and behold, the initial primary outcome of school attendance at 6 months had no results. So had they reported the findings, so they did two things wrong. They called it a prospective trial, and all the major journals only publish trials that are registered as prospective trials, which means that you register them before anybody's recruited. They registered their trial, the full trial, after 56% had been recruited for the feasibility trial, and they only recruited 44 after that, so they had 100 in the full trial. So they violated a major rule of all the major medical journals which they adopted in 2005. Then they wrote up the lightning process study as a prospective trial, so nobody reading that trial would have any idea that they changed their outcome measures after 56% of the participants were selected, or that any participants were recruited before trial registration. That is absent from the trial report that was published. This is research misconduct. This is classic research. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. You cannot do what they did in terms of the registration. You cannot do what they did in terms of changing the outcome measures. And you cannot do what they did in terms of pretending that none of that happened when they published the paper. So, where are we with that paper? That paper is not going to survive, I don't think, for too long. So any statements of whoever spoke, there's no evidence for the lightning process working. Again, I'm not going to say it never helped anybody. I'm not going to say anything like that, because I can't know. But I can say that there's no scientific evidence that it works, when you look at it in a study. And that's what you need for recommendations, for clinical guidelines. You need actual scientific evidence that it works for more than 1 or 2 or 10 people saying, hey, this helped me. Because that's the base of evidence that they have. They just have people saying, oh, it helped me. We don't have all the people who took it who said it made me worse, or the people who took it and it didn't do anything, it just cost them money. You can't have like a commercial product like that and then have some person come up here and promote it based on the statements of people who also have a vested interest in that commercial product. It's really not appropriate. So that's my dog and pony show. Thank you for... Anyway, thank you.